So, is this recording? Okay, so this quickly, let's show. Sorry about this. I've got an HD camera. The light's not that good in my room, and trying to use encoder to run this, it's very slow. So there's the app. It's quite white. Let's add a image control to the canvas. So a developer goes in and adds this. Let's configure that image control. So by default, it adds the bitmap image that looks like that in the top left hand corner. You can move that around if you want. So there's nothing new to that. So I showed this a couple of days ago. So you go in. Let's go and configure that image to something that's nicer. Let's reposition it. It's actually really nice and fluid when you're using it. So now let's add, yesterday I showed that you could add an effect, so you can, a single effect. So let's add a Gaussian blur effect. And that, at the moment you don't see it because it's set to default of 0. So let's blur that a bit. So that's blurring it. So now you can actually, and it's based off the original image, which was the original control, which is the original image, which itself is a bitmap source effect. You can hide that effect so that so if you have multiple effects, you'll be able to see which effects are working on what. So now if you go in and add a second effect, let's add a saturation effect. So you've got the Gaussian blur. Let's hide that saturation, which sits above the Gaussian blur. Let's hide that. So that's all we're going to look at is the saturation effect. So the saturation effect by default set to 0, so it looks quite black and white or shades of grey. And now you saturate it back to 100% to what it was before. So that's the saturation effect going on. So now both of those effects are working off the original effect, which was the original image. So you can go in and you can say, oh, well, I want the saturation effect to be based off the Gaussian blur effect. So now so you can saturate, as you see, the saturation is still there. So if you hide this, the Gaussian blur is still hidden. So if you show this again, the Gaussian blur, which is still hidden, if you change that, the saturation, this image here should also alter. And as you know, what we're rendering on the surface is the actual saturation effect. So it's actually the saturation effect that's inheriting those changes from the Gaussian blur. So now if you go in and you can add a third effect, let's add a directional blur. By default, that directional blur sits on top above the saturation in the Gaussian blur. It automatically inherits the original control. So therefore, if you change that, you're only affecting the original image. So then if you go in and you can say, I want to base the directional blur off the saturation, which itself is based off the Gaussian blur, you do it by just choosing the input. So now the directional blur can be saturated. The result is that you have this image which can be saturated and blurred, Gaussian blurred, as well as directionally blurred. So you can still, if you hide this, nothing shows, because that just shows that the directional blur is the only thing on that's being painted to the UI. It's the only layer, so-called layer, that's being drawn. So if you show that again, you'll see that you can alter the angle of the blur, the directional blur. You could still change the saturation, and the result will still appear, even though the saturation layer isn't visible. And you can even do a Gaussian blur, and you'll still see it still gets rendered. That just has to show that the directional blur, which is the only thing that's visible, is inheriting the saturation in the Gaussian. So that's how effect graphs work.